What's up, guys? Welcome back to Startup Growth Stories from Product 10X, a startup accelerator for early-stage enterprise SaaS startups with a focus on product-led growth. If you are an entrepreneur with a great idea or a founder with a super early-stage company, you are in the right place. Stick around to get insights from other startup founders and learn from peers.
Hi, Nishitha. Welcome to Product 10X podcast. First of all, glad to be seeing you here on this podcast, especially on International Women's Month. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here. I'm also likewise very excited to be here and talk all things startups.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can you please introduce yourself? What are you doing now? What your past experience has been?
Sure. So my name is Nishitha. I currently work for a pharmaceutical company, and I'm right now in the midst of transitioning roles. So for the past 2 years, I worked as a data science analyst, a data science team. I'm primarily looking at patient analytics and real world evidence projects. And now I'm on the business side and doing more of a business translator role. So playing the gap between the business and the technical team. So I worked at a startup called Quick Connect, and that was based on providing a self-service technology platform for small to medium scale businesses. And my degree has nothing to do with anything I spoke with so far. It's economics and IT. Yeah, that's the 30-second intro.
Very nice. First of all, can you briefly talk us through how you got the idea and then how did you really validate even before you started the product?
Sure. So the idea really came from I spent a lot of time I've always really admired cities like Europe and Italy, France. When you go there, there's no Walmart, there's no Target. Maybe they have come, but a lot of the cities that you go to, there's a very unique sense of community between the businesses. So if you're getting your groceries, you don't go to ShopRite or Stop and Shop or these big names. You go to the local grocery store. And when you go, it's like that the person knows who you are. There's like a great sense of community. And even in the town that I grew up, there was a lot of small businesses, retail stores, restaurants, where most of these are family run mom and pop shops. But it's especially in the last 5 years. So this started in 2015. Even then, you would see bigger retailers come in, and the small mom and pops just could not compete. And the main reason was when you have convenience of technology, especially now that we're living through maybe a second technological, revolution, how can if you don't adopt, you're going to be extinct. So but for small to medium scale businesses, a lot of these people don't know anything about technology, anything about building an app, and more importantly, they don't have the resources to do. So how do you provide it to them in a way where it would be, first of all, like, what is the gap there? Where are the opportunities that technology could be helpful for a small business? And then how do we give it to them in a way where it's very intuitive and requires little technological affinity? So that was the motivation behind it. And in terms of product validation, I think honestly that reflecting on the experience, I can say now like that we didn't do enough. We definitely needed to do more. Like, we asked some businesses that I know, some business owners, some other people who are working on it, what do you think? And if you mention an idea in theory, and no one's going to say, oh, that sucks. There might be one or two people that say that, but for the most part, we're people pleasing. Like, we're human. Like, you're gonna say, yeah, like that makes sense, or yeah, like that sounds like a great idea, especially when you're talking to people who are not in this arena. They're not technologists, they're not developers, so their expertise is making coffee or making cooking. So yeah, so I don't think we got validation of the idea, but not product, not the technology validation or the idea validation in a way that is needed for a startup. And I think that's a really important distinction. Hindsight is 2020. So when I look back at it, that's something we definitely didn't do enough. And it shows in our journey too, because we started off with, we had a lot of pivots. We started off with saying, okay, let's make it consumer facing. So we'll mainly target the consumers and have them, go from the consumers to the businesses. So I, as a consumer, if there's any local businesses that I like, I can almost, initially it started as more of a social platform to to combine or bring the community together. And then we said, oh no, if it's a consumer, it might not be the business might be an easier way in, or it might be there's more of a need there. And again, these are all assumptions that we made, but they weren't validated in a way. Like, if I gave you this, I think the best question to ask is, if I gave you this technology today, would you pay for it? And then when you ask that question, it might be blunt, and there's probably better ways of phrasing it, but that's when people will actually give you the real answer. Yeah, it's not a great idea. Oh, it's a great idea, but I don't need it. It's a great idea, but I would only pay for it if it had XYZ. And I think that piece, that question, was something we didn't ask enough in order to go on to the next steps.
Got it. So I think, that's a very important insight that you just put out there, Nishitha, because at Product 10X, what we completely do is to really support those very early stage startups where there is this concept. From concept, you need to put together some ideas to really see what problem we are solving. And then from problem, you go to market validation. And then at some right point, the way you rightly mentioned, as to say, the moment you say, hey, this is the idea that I have, you go try to validate, everybody says, oh yeah, I mean, that sounds wonderful. But then I think the biggest challenge that most founders and entrepreneurs face is the moment you cross from the idea stage and then you come to the product stage, and then there is a time, there is a dollar amount that you associate to it. That is when whether it is business owners, whether it is in the B2B or B2C scenario, the question really becomes, oh yeah, that was a great idea, but then do I have the need right now? And then does it solve my problem that I have, right? That's a very important distinction, as to say, having a great idea is one aspect, but validating that idea and then getting to that, or crossing the chasm to say, yes, from the idea, the concept, we went to a great product that actually solves at least 10 customers initially, is really that whole process. I'm sure you probably would have gone through. That's great. So let's switch gears a bit. I know 5 years back, you were still in the college at that time, and then you were trying to juggle between going to the college and then also trying to manage the whole startup. Can you give some thoughts and your viewpoint on what did you do? How did you really manage the college and the startup at the same time?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot in this question, and the honest answer is I don't know how I did it. I think there was a intrinsic motivation to put time on this project, because if it's your startup, it's your idea, you're more invested in it. But also I was learning so much more through this experience. Then, not to say like that I wasn't learning anything in college, but theory is different than application, right? So I'm a strong believer, while a fundamental education is great, the amount that I've learned in the 2 years I've been 2.5 years that I've been working now, and the experience that I got, and it was such a wide range of experience, because when you're in a startup, you're not playing one role. When you're in a job, you have a pretty siloed, you can play around a little bit, but you're doing one thing. When you're in a startup and with 1 to 3 people, no resources, you're forced to learn about marketing. You're forced to go learn about how to create. I didn't even know what the word deck meant until I did this. Like that's not something like anyone in school, it's PowerPoint.
Yeah.
But now it's okay, this deck means that there's a very like people spend hours on it, and now I know the value of having a very pretty, very concise deck. But yeah, like things like that, they're such small things that it's really hard to teach. You just have to be in the weeds of it. And also just life experience that I was getting. We'll get more into it, but it wasn't all peaches and roses. I think sometimes startups are very glamorized because you only see the success stories. But the truth is that most startups fail, and like we don't talk about that, I think, enough, or it's not really shown. I think it's not given the importance that it deserves, because even though it was a failure, there is a lot of learnings that anyone could have gotten. Anything I think can teach you something. So in terms of that, like the life experience I got dealing with people, I remember like going and talking to VCs. Like they're the most brutal people you'll ever meet, and in a sense, like you're asking for their money, so no one's gonna take it easy on you. But growing up very sheltered, that was the first experience to the real world maybe that I had,
Right.
and it definitely made me grow a thick skin, and it's helped a lot in my second half of my professional career when I started working a traditional job. Like you gain this ability because you have so many different hats to be able to look at things at, I know this is like a very popular consulting term, but a 10,000 foot view. And that becomes really important because, like I said, when you're in your job, you're very siloed, but your portion affects everything else. Nothing that you do is going to be, for the most part, that's it. You do it and then no one else sees it. Nothing else happens with what your work product. So when you have that natural instinct that you've developed, or that I've developed through working in a startup, of kind of saying, okay, I did this. How is this going to affect the development? How is this going to affect the pitches? How is this going to affect our when we go to a customer? What is the implications of it? I think that thinking has helped me immensely and given me a lot of opportunities in, the rest of my career. Definitely I think that those kind of learnings was what motivated me to continue. And
Right.
having said that, it is realistic that if you're gonna do it, don't think I had the traditional college life. Don't get me wrong, I had a lot of fun, made a lot of friends, was pretty active on campus, but I completed my degree in 3 years, so I was already taking a pretty heavy course load. And then I had this project, and I was also a double major. Even though I tried to put emphasis on work hard, play hard, but if I did that, then I had to sacrifice something. And in this case was sleep. So while my roommates would be sleeping until like 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. or whatever, I would have to get up probably earlier to do all the other things beyond that. So I think it's just about prioritizing. And as long as you're like, there's something in it for you and there's that passion, you'll figure it out.
Got it. Let's dig into it a little bit. So as a young entrepreneur, I'm sure you are battling with, of course, your courses and then now the whole of the startup, especially when you went to the initial beta customers. Can you talk through on initially what was the pitch really, and then did they take you seriously? And what was the kind of lessons learned for you, especially when as a college about to graduate, when you go into the customers, how did they really feel? And then how did you really convince them to use the product?
Yeah, so I think there were two, like you can separate the customer pitch into two things. First, it's just getting access and getting someone to hear you out. That itself was a lot of cold calling, cold emailing, using my network to exhaustion, using everyone else's secondary, tertiary connections, just trying to get 15 minutes. So that in and of itself was just so hard, because the one thing, again, going back to idea validation, the types of customers we were targeting, so retailers, small restaurants, coffee shops, their margins are pretty slim to begin with. So when you say, hey, I have this product, but you have to pay for it, They're like, oh no, I don't need it. Immediately, I don't need it. Getting that 15 minutes was a struggle in and of itself. And of course, yeah, I think coming from, I think at that time when we first really started going to customers, I was probably 18, 19. I don't think was that eloquent or well had the presentation skills to be able to articulate myself. Not now, but definitely not back then either. It was when you have to like develop that pitch after the 1,000th time you get that 30-second pitch. But then when you get the 15 minutes, how do you tailor it and what is the right thing to say? I think that was something that was very hard and something I struggled with. The people around me also, everyone who was involved was really great at their job, but none of us were marketers or pitch or public speakers or anything like that. So when you get to that customer, like how do you forget about taking me seriously? Like the truth is I accepted that as a 19-year-old. No one's even now, like I'm not that much older, but I'm like, okay, if my younger brother says something or whatever, I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. It's
Yeah.
just human. It's just the way it is. I think it is what it is. But it was more, how do I explain the product to you in a way that's enticing? That's where, again, another learning is I wish I had a good mentor, not support. I had great support from family, friends, everyone involved, an amazing support system, but a good mentor to help guide who's been through this, who has those skills in creating a pitch, creating a brand identity for the product and helping me refine that. So I think that's another learning that if I like again hindsight 2020, but I think that was really important or one thing I would change.
Got it. So when we take that further in a way, I'm sure founders take many pivots. When you start, the idea could be something. The moment you get into the field, talking to the customers, you realize either the problems are continuously evolving or
Mhm.
your idea needs some more refinement. So from that point of view, can you talk through how many pivots that you have taken? And more than the number of pivots, can you talk through on what is the decision point for you to say, yes, whatever I'm doing, probably it's not working out, and this is the right time for me to do something different? Because at the end of the day, many founders keep on working on one problem again and again until a couple of years, and then either, of course, it will go really big or it's not going anywhere. And then, unfortunately, they fall flat. So from your point of view, what does that decision point really look like for you when you say, hey, right now, as a company, we are pivoting from one idea to another idea?
Yeah, I think it just becomes like you need to build. That's just like part of it, right? Survival. If you are not able to pivot, uh, you just won't get the customers. You won't get to the next stage. For us, I think we had a few. Again, I don't have the number, but I would say all of our pivot points were led by, okay, we've spoken to these customers. They will only like this product if we make this pivot. So it became, at first, we didn't think consumers would be the right person. So we made the pivot to B2B. At that point, we were still thinking a little too broadly. So when we had an MVP and started reaching out to customers, we realized one size doesn't fit all. So we had access and opportunity in the restaurants business. We had one town that the town itself was trying to support and promote local businesses and local restaurants. So they wanted to adopt this. So in that case, we said, okay, if it's just restaurants, we might want to keep these features. We want to remove this or add this. And that was, again, we have a paying customer. Now let's amend to them. So I think the reason why any startup or anyone does it is just you have to. Like that's the reason. You have a customer who has this request, or this is the only way that your product is going to go to market. I think that's the motivation behind it. But to your point, I feel like it takes harder to realize that is when you're in it, you're in it. This is your baby, this is your idea. it's really difficult to separate the emotional aspect of it from the logic of it. Like, I pride
Completely.
myself
Yep.
in being a very logical person, but looking back, I know a lot of my decisions were more emotionally driven than logically driven. The truth is, like, when you, even if someone said, "Oh, that's not working," you like, it's very hard to not push it to the edge, and then finally, when there's no more options, then say, "Okay, fine. Let me pivot." So no, there's, I think, one subtle distinction that I've personally seen makes a good startup and good leader or startup founder, and versus someone who's going to have a more tumultuous journey is, do you make the turn when you have a lot of leeway, or do you make the turn when you're at a T junction, you can only go right or left, you can't go the way
Yeah.
you're going? So I think that being able to have that, and again, it really comes to having the right um mentors or the right team. Like, again, team dynamics is something that's so I think under talked about, but so important to a successful versus non-successful startup. Is these are people, again, they have to, like, they're the ones that are going to bring this vision, especially at a startup. It's not like 100,000 employees where if you don't like one, you're going to go to the other or
Yep.
whatever. It's just it's these three people. So making sure that you build that dynamics and have the right people on your team to be able to speak up and say, "Hey, this is not working. What should we do?" And because if you're the founder, it's your idea, it's just hard to take that criticism, but you have to be open to it, because in the
Yep. Yeah.
long run, that's going to help you.
So on that point, there are two specific points that I want to touch upon. One is you rightly mentioned before about the whole of thinking too broadly about a particular solution. And then when we think too broad, which also means there are different kinds of users and use cases that you need to cater to, versus when you really think through from a one particular problem point of view and then say, okay, if I make this, if there are 10 problems for a particular customer and a particular user, and if I solve this, let's say out of 10 problems, the 5 problems, then there is a highly likelihood that this user will start using. Because at some point of time, what we also realized as a startup accelerator is many founders really start with that broad aspect in the mind, and in which case, as a startup, whether it is MVP or even if you are 1-2 year down the line, it is very difficult to satisfy the needs and the problem solving for multiple users in that sense, right? So for you, what was the kind of scenario where you said, you know what, we've been thinking too broad, and this is the right time for us to really come down to one particular user or industry? What was that process really look like for you?
Yeah, so we built a lot of self-service technology features as a business owner. Whether you were a retail shop that sells, like, maybe clothing, like tchotchke items, things like that, or a coffee shop or a restaurant, the idea was you could come to our app and then pick and choose almost what piece of technology you wanted to use. But the truth is, even if you take something simple as having a platform for loyalty, how a retail store would use loyalty versus how a coffee shop would use loyalty versus a restaurant is fundamentally different. So when we started reaching to customers, the constant, I think what was happening is we had a mold and we were trying to use that mold to, or trying to put the customers in the mold, but they wouldn't fit. So then we would make small adjustments to try to fit that one customer. But what happens is, if you, again, take that 10,000-foot view, generally restaurants work in a similar process. How they might approach it is different from coffee shops, and there might be differences from restaurant A to restaurant B, but it's easier to capture the process at a restaurant level versus saying, I want to do both restaurants and coffee shops. So there's different products, your sale volumes are much different, your price points are different, and just the type of promotions that they would run is different. So I think what made that light go off was we spent so much time, like, again, like, we were trying to put these customers in these mold, and they wouldn't fit, they wouldn't adopt the product. And it's okay, we can either spend more time cutting pieces, adding, removing, whatever, trying to fit, which still going the same way, or we can take a step back and say, okay, how does this process look like in general? Like, focus in on one industry.
Yep.
Where do we have the most access? And then that goes back to, we were forced to pivot because we had a town saying, if you can make this product like this, we will adopt it. So then there's your motivation. Like, now I have a set of paying customers, let me make it catering to them. But again, you don't want to make it too specific, because then, what happens to the next town you will go on to, or the next, like, how do you scale up? So it's a really delicate balance about how big or how narrow or how broad your universe definition is. But I think finding that balance again in the beginning, like, that should be so much of your time spent, is what are you, and learning as much as you can about that customer and about the current process before even building anything or before trying to solve that problem.
Makes sense. As a continuation to that, what we are really saying is, at this point of time, for any startup and the product to work, it's very easy to think in terms of saying, hey, you know what, I have a great startup or a product solution for a market, for a industry. But unfortunately, unless we really get on to a particular set of customers, find what their problems are, help them solve their problems, it doesn't really matter how much ever we dream about solving the industry problems, but we need to really start at the ground level, really helping the individual customers on their own. And then, of course, in your case, probably once you were able to successfully help some of the restaurants, there have been a natural evolution to say, go to the adjacency coffee shops or maybe something else, and then slowly expand, rather than thinking too broad and then later on realizing that there are so many features in the product at this point of time that may not be helping one particular customer to solve their complete problems.
Yeah, for sure. Like, in our example, if we started off with the town and say, okay, we have 10 restaurants in that town, like, of course, even within those 10 restaurants, there is going to be differences. But if I can create a product where 7 out of 10 uses that product, then, if first of all, I have a use case, I have paying customers, and now if I want to expand to different business types within that town, or even just take that and get that same thing, making small customizations is going to be inevitable. Like, you have to be dynamic in your product and your product, especially if you're a technology service, because the needs are constantly changing. If you're not able to keep up with that, you're just not going to keep up. You're going to be left behind. And especially in a market where there's just so many options, there's constantly new technologies, new platforms that you can use. If you can't make your customer a believer and almost make sure that you're actually making them dependent on your tech, it's going to be hard to retain them. So I think, like, it's important to also say, like, you want to be able to be flexible to meet the needs of your customers. But I think, yeah, like, having a more generalized base, and then you can add one or two things as needed. Like, that's important. That definitely, I feel like now, again, if I had to do it again, that's where I would start.
Wonderful. Yeah. Again, from many of the founders that we talk to, they have some concept idea and now they have a product. And then many of them say, oh, you know what, now I have a product. It's all about fundraise and sales. And that's really all we're a next billion-dollar company. But from your point of view, how much do you think the fundraise really would have helped you versus the actual concept and the validation of the idea itself?
Yeah, I don't think funding I don't think that really had too much of a problem effect on our particular case. I would say our struggles were more fundamental. So it was again in that product, that universe definition, that initial planning. We were more execution first than thinking through doing out these business process plannings, things like that. Again, I was very young. The people around me, this was like our first experience, but that if we had spent that time, the first 6 to 7 months, just really interviewing the customers, understanding the problem, understanding the current state of business, like if I'm going to serve a restaurant, how does a restaurant work? Just
Yep.
at the basic level. I think that was one really, when I look back at what went wrong or where were the opportunities for improvement, I think that was definitely number one. Number two, I think it was from me, if you're the face of it or you're someone, the leader or whatever, if you're the idea, I think you need to take the responsibility of having, even if you're not like how do I phrase this? Even if you're not like the expert in every single field, I think you have to take it upon yourself to be able to learn as much as you can and at a high level. So at that point, I wasn't very technologically knowledgeable. So there came to a point where I was completely dependent on our development partners to tell me what's the right way. Or I didn't have enough knowledge when they presented me the options to weigh the pros and cons and say, no, this is why we should do it versus this isn't, this is why we should look at this. And the truth is like that is something that has like I developed over the last 3-4 years. But at the time when those decisions needed to be made, I either had to, since I didn't have the knowledge, I should have brought someone in to help make those decisions. So I think that's where, from a leadership standpoint, I think I definitely could have done better. I consider that one of my biggest learnings and failures, and not in a negative connotation, but it's the truth. If you're going to take responsibility for something, I think you needed to have that. And me not having that technical knowledge definitely affected some of the decisions. The reason why, when we looked to be more dynamic and agile, if we had a customer need, it became harder to adopt to that because of the way the product was built. So I think that was another big, rather than money, I think that was like a big opportunity for improvement. And then finally, I would say team, having people that really believe in who are as passionate about you and the idea, and not just yes men. I think it's good to have healthy debate, like people that can come in and say, challenge an idea in a way where, okay, I think we should do this because of XYZ. Like this is like being able to support their ideas and coming to the table and saying no, like saying no, just fundamentally. And also I think what happens is when you have that passion, you're willing to go above and beyond that just your purview. If you don't, and I think that really is so important in the early stages of a startup, because you're just forced to play so many hats. If you don't have that innate passion for it, it's just not going to work. That's the truth. And it's not like you have unlimited funds where you can just, it's like, who cares whether you believe in the idea or not, we're just going to keep giving you a paycheck. So you're going to execute. So I think those three were, for our experience, that was where I see the biggest improvement. Like even if we had more money, I don't think that would change the outcome of it. If anything, like we would have just exhausted more resources before coming to the same conclusion.
Got it. So, I mean, I think that's a great insight that you have given, Nishitha, because especially a lot of people think the more money put on a problem, the better the results are. But fundamentally, having a vision, having set of problem to solve, identifying the right users, the right use cases, and making sure that is a big enough problem for those users to be solved. Sometimes there are problems, but they are not the problems for you to solve or create a product that really you can ask for a dollar amount at the end of the day, right? There are either small enough problems, simple enough problems. So it's really the question of saying, are these problems big enough for me to really start solving, and then really bringing the whole team to make sure that they believe in you, walk them towards the mission, I think
Yeah.
is probably the biggest lesson that you took away from the whole experience.
Yeah. It's like this, if you don't, if you think about a house, like money might get you great interior designs. You'll get the best sofas, best whatever, best artwork. But if the foundation isn't there, who cares like what you have, what decorations you have? It's gonna crumble. It might not, it might be 1 year from now, it might be 10 years from now. And we see this with big examples in the news all the time. They have so much money, but there's just basic problems. And that's not an affront. Of course, if we had more money, there's just more, you can throw more resources at it. But until, like, to your point, is this a problem where, you know, that where I can have someone, I think it really comes down to, is someone going to pay for it and how many people? I think
Really?
that's at the end of the day, the question you have to ask, no matter how maybe controversial.
Completely. Yeah, yeah. That's nice. We are coming almost to the end of our discussion. By the way, I have a 11-year-old daughter. She always looks upon for solving problems in the technology and solving the world problems with the help of technology. As a founder, what is your advice for young founders, and especially who are either planning to start a startup or who are running startups now?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I'm qualified to give advice, if this is just more my learning, or the biggest thing that I came out of this experience was being not getting rid of the fear of failure. Like we have, I think failure is often given such a negative connotation, and it's hard, it's not good. We don't want to encourage it, but we grow up thinking failure is the worst thing that can happen. If you fail, if your startup fails, if you fail class, you fail your test, that's it. Especially growing up Asian American, the bar is just set so high for you that failure wasn't an option. So when I started this journey, if you like anything that's worth doing, you will fail at some point. Whether maybe not the entire project, but one customer pitch, something like it's inevitable that you're gonna not face it. What happens is, especially when you grow up with that really high standard, and I think I'm a pretty competitive person myself, so it was very hard for me to accept that failure and to take it and say, okay, how do I learn from this and then make sure that, or move on, basically. How do I learn from this and move on? But regardless, I know I've been saying all of what didn't work, but I have no regrets about the experience at all. It was a little bit of a, if anything, I wish I didn't put as much of my own money into it, but nonetheless, like it was such a great learning, and the amount of life experience, knowledge, connections that I've got through this experience that I've been able to leverage in my current job, and has actually put me up, has helped me stand out in my role, in honestly gave me a full career. Like I told you how I didn't have technical, I thought, I felt I didn't have the technical expertise. So I ended up taking a technical internship, and then the rest, as they say, is history. That opened up the gates to what I do for a living now. It was a career I never considered before. So without this experience, I wouldn't, be where I am today. So I really think it's hard in the moment, of course, to take your time when things don't go your way or you have that failure, take your time to reel in it. But then just, if you take away the emotion of failing, what went wrong, being able to dissect it, doing that autopsy and saying, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, and then still holding your head and going on to the next day. I know, like, people always say, like, failure is a stepping stone to success. It's hard to accept that in the moment, but even if it's not the stepping stone, that's part of your journey. It's not gonna, like, whatever happened is not going to define the rest of what could happen. That it's up to you to define what's next. So I think that if I have any advice to anyone, would be just being able to accept it and getting comfortable with it. Because if you're going to do a startup, like, the truth is you're probably going to fail more times than you succeed. So you might as well
Yeah.
get used to that now.
Wonderful. First of all, thanks a lot, Nishta. I think
Yeah.
this is a wonderful discussion and great insights. And this is super valuable for us, especially because there are so many founders and entrepreneurs out there who really wants to start something. First of all, either they have a complete business background or a technology background, and then each and every entrepreneurs, they underestimate what is there on the other side. And typically what happens is it's very difficult to come half the way between and then make a great success story out of it. And that's really where we at Product 10X, we strongly believe in. Whenever we hear about all the success stories of $1 billion or $10 billion exits, they're all great, absolutely. But there are definitely more founders and entrepreneurs who can actually go to the $250 million exits as well. So with the right amount of mentorship and acceleration, there is so much of potential for many of these founders. And we really want to be there for these founders to really get them from the idea to concept to the whole product and the sales. That's really what we do at this point of time.
Yeah.
And from today, your insights, I'm really sure there are so many young entrepreneurs out there who are going to really appreciate your insights, because a lot of people talk about the success stories for sure, but what you have done today is amazing in terms of bringing out those lessons learned. So
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I think it's important that we look, everyone's gonna like it's important that we talk about it. It's not just Zuckerberg or whoever else you want to look at. Like everyone has that learnings. And I think to your point, like if I had a company like Product 10X, someone coaching me, being able for me to say, that's the other thing, right? You can't do this alone. Like you have to have a good team around you and people who've experienced this and said, this is working, this isn't working. At the end of the day, you have to take it as a founder, it's on you. Like you make that, you should be the one making the call.
yeah.
But having those diverse opinions is really helpful. So I think it's great and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Nishita. Talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Bye.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Startup Growth Stories from Product 10X. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletter or review startup material at product10x.com. Until next time.